Chapter 24. What the Cyber Said. Ryder says I better keep my mouth closed or I'll be catching flies, but I can't help it. The more I look around, the more my jaw drops open. For instance, what Lanaya calls home is so huge and spacious, it's almost like living outside, and each room, which Lanaya calls a space, has a different purpose. Some are filled with light and make you feel wide awake, work spaces, and what she calls it conversational. Other spaces are soft and shadowy, and those, she says, are for restful thinking or dream rooms for sleeping. Most of the spaces have openings or windows that look out on the green landscape or up into the deep blueness of the sky. The floors are made of this cool, slick but not slippery stuff they call marbellium, and it changes color and surface depending on who occupies the space and what their mood is. Plus, you can make any wall into a fully three-dimensional hollowscape simply by touching it. Then you really do feel like you're in any one of 1,000 different landscapes, from something called lush African jungle to nighttime lunar surface. Do all proofs live in this kind of splendor? Ryder wants to know, his old geezer eyes sparkling with interest. Not all of them, no, says Lanaya. Before she can explain, 2 adult proofs glide into the room. A male with a small, dark, pointy beard, and a female with golden hair done up in thick weaves. They're both wearing sleek white tunics and little bits of sky-colored jewelry that glint in the sun, and like Lanaya, they're both perfect and beautiful, like actors you'd seen on a 3D, only better, and that makes it hard not to stare. This is Jin and Bree, Lanaya says, giving each of them a quick kiss and hug, my contributors. It turns out Jin and Bree are what normals would call parents, but since each proved baby is genetically improved before conception, they're called contributors. Jin and Bree are obviously pleased to have their daughter home, but they aren't exactly happy to see us. Child, what have you done? Is the first thing Jin wants to know. You can't bring normals into Eden. It's forbidden. We'll discuss that later, she tells him. Right now, we've got a life to conserve. What? Out in the Takfi, quickly. And that's how Bean came into the private palace of a future Master of Eden. We figure out the Master of Eden part when Bree mentions that Lanaya has been granted certain special privileges because in a few years she'll be one of the Masters who make all the decisions for the Prove world. Being a future Master explains a lot, like her being allowed to travel into the herb or distributing edibles to the normals, or bringing us into Eden. Apparently, a future Master is given what Jin calls unlimited educational opportunities, which means she can do just about anything she wants while she's learning how to be a leader. That includes, of course, the opportunity to make mistakes, Jin reminds her sternly, tugging at the point of his perfect little chin beard. And this, child, is a very big mistake. I'll give him credit. As soon as he sees how sick Bean is, he shuts up and helps me carry her into one of the sleeping spaces. Then he and Bree fuss over Bean as if she was their own daughter. Jin says people in Eden don't get sick this way anymore, but they do have special life-sustaining systems on hand for those injured in accidents. We can stabilize her, he says, much to my relief. We can do that much. The life-sustaining system turns out to be a sort of portable bed with a curved plexus shield. The machine helps Bean breathe, and it has these special light tubes that keep her fever under control too. I asked Jin if they have a device that will make her wake up, and he gives me a sad look and says, I don't know. I suppose it's possible. Anything is possible. And then he and Bree leave the room to make contact with what they call the authority to discuss the situation. The scary thing is, the life-sustaining device looks like some sort of fancy latch-boss coffin, and poor Bean is so thin and pale, and her breathing is so shallow that she looks more dead than asleep. I put my mouth on the curve of the glass cover and go, Bean, can you hear me? This is Spaz, okay? I want you to hang on. Don't go, Bean, please, until Ryder gently guides me out of the room. I go, maybe the authority has a wake-up device. Maybe, he says. That's what I'm hoping. If they can make the sky blue and the world green, they can wake up one small girl, right? While we're waiting to hear what the authority has to say, Lanaya takes us into what she calls her think space. Each room has a cyber intelligence to control the environment and so on, she tells us, but the think space is special. It's a teaching cyber. You have to be careful what you ask the cyber because it always delivers. At first, it looks like any of the other rooms, but when Lanaya asks the question, the wall seems to dissolve and the answers appear as images. Like she'll ask, "What is Earth?" And suddenly we're floating high above this gauzy blue planet. We're still in the room and our feet on the floor, of course, but it feels like we're looking down on a planet 2,000 miles below. The illusion is so powerful and so convincing that Littleface starts to cry, and Bree starts to take him to the edible space and give him something she calls cookies and milk, while Lanaya asks the cyber to give us a tour. "Anywhere you'd like to go?" she asks Ryder. "Any special place you'd like to see?" "What if the place no longer exists?" Ryder asks mysteriously. "Try it," says Lanaya with a shrug. "See if the cyber can remember." Ryder takes a deep breath. "In that case, I've always wanted to see the Grand Canyon." "Let it be," Lanaya says. Suddenly, we're gliding through the most amazing place I've ever seen, even more amazing and exciting than the famous chase scene in Coley Riggin's Battle Quest. It's like something from another world, Mars maybe, but it was right here on Earth. The cyber voice tells us this is the biggest canyon that ever was, until the Big Shake destroyed it. The canyon looks like a city made for giants, with thousands of pinnacles of stone much, much taller than the highest scraper ever built. The cyber tells us the canyon was created by something called erosion, and that explains it, but I don't think anything can explain it, not really, because the canyon looks and feels too big to hold in your mind all at once. The shadows keep changing, so the place seems somehow alive, and you feel like you could stare at it for 1,000 years and still not see everything. When the cyber tour is over, Ryder sits there weeping and gasping for breath. "Pay no heed," he tells me, wiping his eyes on his sleeve. "I never thought to see the place. My grandfather often spoke of a trip to the Grand Canyon. He'd never seen anything so magnificent. But none of his old photographs survived the shake, so all I had were his stories and my imagination." "How does it compare?" Lanaya wants to know. "Your imagination to the cyber image?" Ryder smiles. "I wasn't thinking big enough, that's for sure, and I had no idea about the colors or the way the sky above seems to echo what lies below. Imagine something that enormous being destroyed by a mere earthquake. It's another proof of how powerful the Big Shake really was. That we puny humans survived is almost as incredible as the shake itself, don't you think?" "I never thought of it that way," Lanaya says, a bit uneasily. Then she turns to me and goes, "Anything you'd like to see?" I think about it. The thing is, we're already in the most amazing place I've ever dreamed of. More like never dreamed of. But there is something I want to see, even if it isn't as big or grand as the Grand Canyon. "Can the think space show us what's making Bean sick?" I ask. "I don't know," Lanaya says. "Let's find out." She speaks a few words to the cyber. A moment later, a human body rises from the floor. Not a real body, of course, but transparent version where you can see inside. As the body turns, some of the bones and organs begin to glow, highlighting where the sickness comes from. "Leukemia," the cyber voice says. "Any of a group of neoplastic diseases of the blood-forming organs, resulting in an abnormal increase in the production of leukocytes, often accompanied by anemia and the enlargement of the lymph nodes, spleen, and liver." Then the body dissolves, and we're inside the bloodstream, which is loaded with things that look like fat white tires. The cyber voice tells us the tire-looking things are white blood cells, and having too many white blood cells makes the blood weak and tired. Untreated, it can lead to death. Among the improved population, genetic extinction of the leukemia disease group was achieved in the early 21st century, the cyber voice says. Backtimer treatments involve complex chemical therapies and bone marrow transplants, specific methods that are no longer available. Then the blood fades away, and we're back in the think space, letting the words bang around inside our brains until we understand. For the first time since we met, Lanaya doesn't want to meet my eyes. "It isn't fair," I say. "Proofs never get the blood sickness, so nobody bothered to remember the cure? That's what the cyber said, isn't it?" Lanaya nods. "I'm sorry," she says. It feels like a fist has clenched inside my head. My face is hot and my tongue is so thick with anger it's hard to get the words out. "I don't care how perfect you are, or how beautiful. Bean is 1,000,000 times better than anybody in Eden," I say. But you're going to let her die because she wasn't improved before she was born? I'm sorry, Lanaya says. I hate you, I tell her. I hate all of you. And then I run to the room where my sister lies in her transparent coffin, waiting to die. Chapter 25. Thinking about the future. Later that day, we take Bean to a place they call the primary laboratory. Lanaya's parents, her contributors, got permission from the authority to bring Bean here to see if there's anything that can be done. So far, nothing has changed. Bean still lies in the long sleep, although she doesn't seem to have gotten any worse since they put her in the glass coffin. In the back times, they had people called doctors who took care of sick people, but proofs hardly ever get sick, so they have medical technicians instead. The medtechs mostly do stuff like patch up proofs who get injured in accidents, so they don't really know what to make of Bean. All they can do is tell the prime cybers to search for data about the blood sickness. While we're waiting, Lanaya shows us around the primary laboratory. The prime is where approved babies are made and improved, which makes it the most important place in Eden. Most of the place is underground because when the proofs were first starting out, there was still poison from all the volcanic eruptions kicked off by the Big Shake. The original survivors thought the radiation came from nuclear waste, and some of it did, but the worst came from within the Earth itself, Lanaya explains. The natural radiation and the volcanic gases made the air toxic for almost a century. The average lifespan of humans dropped to something like 20 years. That's when genetic engineering really came into its own. Until then, large-scale modification had been forbidden, more or less. We're passing through the oldest part of the Prime, which has been preserved as a reminder of how bad things were right after the Shake. There are holo images of the original genetic engineering team, and all of them are wearing gas masks. In one of the images, they're standing around a small crib, holding up a crying baby. I noticed the baby doesn't have a gas mask, Ryder observes. That's one of the first things they improved, Lanaya says, the ability to tolerate higher levels of toxic gases. Every child of Eden still carries that improved gene, although we no longer need it. And does that child still survive? Ryder wants to know, pointing at the image of the baby. Lanaya gives him a strange look. That holo was taken over 200 years ago, she says. That's 100 years more than the average prove life. The first child has been dead a long time. Ah, says Ryder, as if he's satisfied some unspoken question. Lanaya seems amused by the question. I know you normals think we've solved the riddle of eternal life, but we haven't, she tells him. Before engineering, certain rare humans lived as long as 120 years. That survival rate has been incorporated into the coding for every child of Eden, but we haven't been able to improve upon it. And there's no way to reverse the aging process, Ryder asks wistfully. Lanaya shakes her beautiful head. Sorry, no. We can activate the genes that lengthen lifespan, but we can't reverse aging. So what happens when proofs get old, he asks, as if the subject is close to his heart. They age gracefully, Lanaya says with a smile. That's the best we can do. They let me visit with Bean, which is really sort of pointless since she doesn't know I'm there, but for some reason it makes me feel a little better just looking. If anything can be done, we'll do it, Jin promises when he finds me there staring through the glass. I know they're trying to help, but I'm still pretty cranked about the unfairness of it all. So what do you care if a normal dies? I say. They die every single day from all kinds of disease, and you don't do anything to stop that. Jin gives me this wise and understanding look and says, it's easy to ignore what you can't see, and most of us have never even seen a normal. As you know, I think it was a mistake to bring you people into Eden, but now that you're here, we feel compelled to help, if only because Lanaya wants us to. She's really that big a deal, your daughter? Is it a big deal to be a latch boss in the herb? The biggest, I say. Being one of the masters is even bigger, Jin says. Everything that happens in Eden is controlled, ultimately, by the masters. Masters are not chosen or elected, they're designed for the job, specifically improved to have leadership qualities and the ability to plan for the future, to plan even beyond their own lifespan. That's very important to us, thinking about the future. Yeah? What's so important about the future if you're not alive to see it? Jin looks at me like he can't believe I don't know what he's talking about. That was the mistake the backtimers made, not planning far enough ahead. They knew a planet-wide disaster like the Big Shake would happen eventually, but when it did happen, they weren't ready for it. More than 1 billion people perished during the Shake, and in the dark times that followed, all because nobody wanted to think about the future. Thinking about the future may be great for proofs, I tell him, but normals don't even have a past, let alone a future. Everyone has a past, he says evasively. You're wrong. I tell what happened in memory since everybody started probing, how things in the herbs seem to be getting worse, and how a lot of the latch bosses are too busy probing to care. When I get to the part about Mongo the Magnificent, Jin's perfect eyes widen in horror. I had no idea, he exclaims. That's when Ryder decides to pipe up. So far, he's mostly been quiet, listening to me spout off. There's something else we discovered, he points out, fixing his saggy old eyes on Jin. Brain probes are made here in Eden with your technology and then smuggled into the herb. Jin quickly shakes his head. Impossible, he says, sounding shocked. Why would we do that? Ryder shrugs. You tell me, are there proofs who would like to see the herb and all the people in it disappear? Jin grimaces uncomfortably. I suppose there are. Well, if someone wanted to wipe us out or encourage us to self-destruct, rotting our minds would be a good place to start. You must be mistaken, Jin says, protesting, but you can tell he's worried that it might be true. Take away memory, the sense of who we are, and human beings revert to animal behavior, Ryder says, and animals are easier to exterminate than humans. Exterminate? What a terrible word, he exclaims. Why would we want to do that? Ryder shrugs again. He almost looks amused by Jin's reaction. Why would you want to exterminate us? Because we still exist. Because we're a reminder of what you used to be. Because the herb surrounds Eden. Because we're dangerous. There are plenty of reasons. Take your pick. This can't be, Jin says to himself. I'll go to the authority and ask them, and if necessary, the authority will go to the masters. I'm sure you must be wrong. But he doesn't sound sure. He sounds more like a man hearing something he'd rather not think about, even if he knows about it all along. Later that same day, the word comes back that the cybers have found something interesting. Interesting is Bree's word. To me it sounds impossible, but I want to believe it anyway. The cybers could find no data on the old cures, she says at first, which opens the darkness inside my heart. Evidently, it had something to do with specific amounts of very toxic chemicals, what they called chemotherapy, and controlled exposure to radiation. It's a wonder anybody survived a cure like that. But apparently they did, and quite successfully too. But it doesn't matter, because we no longer have access to their ancient technologies. So there's nothing you can do for her, I say. I didn't say that, Bree says. I said we can't replicate the backtimer cure. But the cybers have an interesting suggestion. It may be possible to give your sister an improved gene, several improved genes actually, that control how the body replaces blood cells. And that would make it better, I ask. If it works, Bree says, we won't know until we try. What if it doesn't work, I ask. Bree gives me a long, sad look. You already know the answer to that. She's right, I do. Chapter 26. The Bean is back. 3 days after they inject her with the new and improved genes, my little sister Bean gets her own personal future. I'm there when it happens. At first, I don't notice anything different. I'm sort of staring into the glass coffin thing that's keeping her barely alive, thinking about stuff from when we were both little, stupid stuff that wouldn't mean anything to anybody but me or Bean, like the time Charlie caught her feeding crumbs to the rats behind her unit, and she acted all surprised that he was upset and told him, "Rats are people too." Charlie demanded to know where she got such a crazy idea, and she said, "From you, Daddy." Because, see, Charlie was always calling people rats. That's when poor old Charlie realized his 4-year-old daughter was a whole lot smarter than he was, and on her way to being smarter than anybody else in the herb, period. Anyhow, there I am, looking right at her and remembering stuff so hard that at first I don't even notice that she's staring back at me. Her eyes are open and she's looking at me, and not with dead or unconscious eyes either. She's really looking hard, like she's trying to figure out what I'm thinking. And what I'm thinking is that I must be dreaming and dreading that any second I'll startle myself awake and Bean will still be in the long sleep, or worse. But I'm not dreaming. It's true. The Bean is back. I must have yelled or cried out because everybody comes running. Ryder and Lanaya and Jin and the med techs who gave her the injections, they're almost as excited as I am. The med techs because they didn't know if the gene therapy would work, and the others because they know how much Bean means to me. The med techs lift up the glass cover of the coffin thing. It's not like Bean is suddenly strong enough to get up or anything. She's really weak, barely able to raise her hand and touch my face, but I don't care. 5 minutes ago I thought she was a goner, and now she's back alive and whispering that she had the weirdest dream. I dreamed we went to Eden, she says. Isn't that strange? We did, I tell her. We're here, and you're getting better. Suddenly, I feel really bad about being so borked off with the proofs. If it wasn't for Linnea and her people, Bean would be dead for sure. Maybe some of them hate normals and wish we'd disappear, but they saved my little sister, so they can't be all bad. Nobody looks happier than Ryder. The old geese is grinning so hard I'm afraid his last few teeth will fall out. His whole face is smiling, including his eyes, and he wraps his spindly arms around my shoulders and gives me a hug that takes my breath away. You did it, boy, he exclaims, wheezing with excitement. You risked your life for a fair maiden, and now she lives. Oh, what a wonderful story. I can't wait to write it down. Do you realize what you've done? You've given me a happy ending. But the proof saved her, not me, I remind him. And besides, it was your idea to come to Eden. Ryder shakes his head. It's as if his ancient, watery gray eyes can see all the way inside me. Oh, yes, we helped along the way, Linnea and me, and even Littleface. But it was you who started the journey, son. None of this would have happened if you didn't have the courage to imagine it first. He's obviously zoomed, but I don't have the heart to tell him so. But I know who the real hero is, and it isn't me or even the brave Linnea. It's an old man with a white beard and a walking stick and a heart so big it won't let him stop thinking he can change the world by writing things down in a book that no one will ever read. Not long after Bean wakes up from the long sleep, Jin has this whispery conversation with Linnea. They both look worried. As soon as your sister can be moved, we'll have to leave the Prime, she tells me later, keeping her voice down. People are talking. She doesn't have to explain about people talking. She means the word is spreading that a ragged band of normals have been allowed into Eden, which may or may not be forbidden depending on who interprets the rules. So the longer we stay at the primary laboratory, the more proofs become aware of our presence. But she's not all the way better, I remind her. She can barely walk, and she still doesn't want to eat. I know, Linnea says, patting my shoulder. Don't worry. We'll still take good care of her, but in my own spaces, away from prying eyes. So the very next day, we all leave the Prime and return to the incredible place that Linnea calls home. Bean doesn't remember being there, of course, and she's at least as amazed as I am by the rooms that change scenes according to your mood. She is still pretty weak and can't stand up for long without feeling dizzy, but she wants to know how everything works. And when Linnea explains, Bean seems to understand, which means she's way ahead of me. It's a logical extension of interactive cybernetic intelligence, Linnea tells her, a computer that can project itself into a three-dimensional landscape. Of course, these are only holoscapes, illusions. Bean's eyes are so bright they could light the dark. I used to pretend something like this, she says, gazing in wonder at the purple mountains and green valleys of a holoscope called Montana. I'd lie on my sleeping mat and imagine that I was in a completely different world. What kind of world? Linnea wants to know. A world without walls, Bean says. A world where you can go outside without being afraid. You're describing Eden, says Linnea. I guess, Bean says. But I meant the herb. What it would be like if everything hadn't been destroyed, if people stopped hurting each other and grew things instead. All those green things out there. Grass and trees. It's so lovely. So peaceful, Bean says, dreamily. Grass and trees. Linnea takes Bean by the hand and leads her to a window. That isn't a holoscape, she says, pointing. Those are real trees, real grass. Bean looks outside for a long time and then sighs deeply. It's beautiful. It might as well be a holoscope, she says. Linnea looks at her curiously. Why is that? She asks. Because we can't stay here, Bean says, can we? When I'm better, you'll send us back to the gray concrete and the acid rain and the latch gangs. Linnea stares at the grass and the trees and then looks from Bean to me. Her eyes are shiny and fierce. Not if I can help it, she vows. Chapter 27. What the Boy Said. 2 important things happened on our 7th day in Eden. The first is that Bean learned to play a game called chess, and the second is what happened to Littleface when he first learned to talk. The chess thing went down like this. Linnea and Jin are in the game space, a room that changes shape and layout depending upon the game being played. In this case, chess. Chess is one of those deals that looks real simple but isn't. You move 16 pieces around a board divided into 64 squares. Some pieces, like drones, can only move one square at a time. Others, like crooks or wizards, can go all the way across the board in different directions. The object is to trap the piece they call the master. Jin says it's an ancient game based on strategy and warfare and stuff, one of the few games to survive the Big Shake, more or less intact. There are hologram versions with animated pieces as big as human beings, if you want, but Jin says that's just a distraction, because the real game is played inside your head. Great players don't even need a board or pieces, he tells Bean. They can visualize the entire game with every possible combination of moves. He's explaining all this as if he's just being polite. He doesn't really expect a normal like Bean to understand. While he's talking, Lanaya moves one of her pieces and says, "Checkmate." That means she won. I almost never beat Jin, she tells me, but apparently he's distracted. Jin smiles like it doesn't matter who wins, but when they start the next game, he's all business, thinking so hard it takes him 5 minutes to move a piece. It works because he's got Lanaya in checkmate in exactly 10 moves. "See," she tells me, "I told you he was good. I like to play chess for fun, but Jin takes it very seriously. He's one of the best players in Eden." "Nonsense," he says. "There are at least 6 players who are better than me." But the way he smiles, you can tell he's pleased. When Bean asks if she can play chess, too, he seems happy that she's interested. "Why don't you play with your foster brother?" he suggests. "I'll act as a kind of referee to make sure you get the moves right." "No," I tell him. "You'd better play Bean. She could beat me easy." Jin chuckles and shakes his head, as if amused at my stupidity. "How do you know if you haven't played?" he asks. "Believe me, I know," I say. So it ends up with Jin playing Bean while me and Lanaya watch. Ryder is off on his own doing something he calls making notes for his book, and Bree is taking care of Littleface, which both of them seem to enjoy. Anyhow, at first Jin tries to take it easy on Bean, like he doesn't want to discourage her from trying to learn the game, which is so complicated, he says. It takes years and years to get really good at it. So imagine his surprise when he discovers that he can't beat a 12-year-old girl from the herb. "Did you really mean to do that?" he asks, perking up when she makes a particular move about 5 minutes into their first game. "Uh-huh," Bean says. "You'll see." "I'll see?" Jin chuckles to himself, like she can't possibly mean what she's saying. 7 moves later, he finds out. "Oh, this is fun," Bean says, knocking over one of his taller pieces. Jin stares at the board, then he stares at her. "Another," he says, setting up the pieces for a new game. They end up playing for hours. Bean never does beat him again, because from then on he takes her seriously, but he's never able to beat her either. All of their games end in what they call a standoff, which means neither side can win. And Jin looks like he doesn't know whether to be angry or ecstatic. "Do you see?" he demands of Lanaya. "Do you understand what happened here?" Nobody gets a bigger kick out of seeing Jin get beat than Lanaya. "Oh, I saw what happened," she tells him, "but I can't say I'm surprised." "But she's a normal," Jin exclaims. "Yes," says Lanaya, "and normal can't be smarter than approve. Is that what you're saying?" Jin shakes his head as if he's confused. Confused not so much by what Lanaya said, but by his own feelings. "I try to have an open mind on these matters," he says, "but I've been playing chess since I was 5 years old, and she just learned the game today. How is it possible?" "Mm-hmm," Lanaya says, her eyes bright and knowing. "Do me a favor. Don't say anything more. Just think about it. Think about what it means if a girl from the herb can beat you at your best game." Jin starts to say something, then changes his mind. "I'll do that," he promises. "I'll think on it." Bean gives him a look that says, "Are these people zoomed or what?" The truth is, I've got no answer. We've been here for a week, and I still don't know what it's like to be a prove or to think like one. Okay, here's the deal on Littleface. Like I said, Bree's spending a lot of her time taking care of him, which is sort of unnecessary, really, because he's pretty good at taking care of himself. Not that you'd know it when Bree's around. Then all he wants to do is get hugs or make signs that he's hungry or smile and dance around until he has her complete attention. Whatever he's doing, it's working, because not long after the chess game ends, Bree marches into the game space and makes an announcement. "I'm adopting this child," she says in a way that makes me think she's working herself up to it for hours. "I've made my decision. Don't try to talk me out of it." Poor Jin. He's getting it from all sides. He can't win at his favorite game. His daughter's giving him the sort of advice that a parent usually gives to a child, and now his lovemate announces she's going to adopt a normal. Not just any normal, but a kid who had to raise himself more or less like an animal. A kid who doesn't know how to talk and never had a bath until Bree scrubbed him clean. Bree, Jin says, exasperated. Don't you Bree me, she answers right back, her eyes flashing. But you know the rules, he reminds her. Bree crosses her arms. Being angry makes her even more beautiful, which means that looking at her almost takes my breath away. What I know is that this child needs me, and I need him. Surely there are others who can care for him, his own people. He doesn't have any people, she exclaims, and you're not listening. I need him. What are you talking about? He asked, genuinely puzzled. I didn't know it until I saw him standing in our door space, but I've missed raising a child. I love Lanaya, and I know that she loves me, but she never really needed me, not the way this child does. Bree, what a terrible thing to say. Lanaya steps in, placing a hand on Jin's shoulder. Father, she says softly but forcefully, I never call you that. It's a back-timer word we don't use. Nevertheless, you are my father, and Bree is my mother, and I love you both dearly. But what Bree says is true. I was designed to be a master eventually. That means I'm usually self-reliant, even for a proof. It can't have been much fun raising me. Bree suddenly looks crushed. Tears leak from her beautiful eyes. I didn't mean it that way, she says. You are a lovely child, Lanaya. It was fascinating watching you grow up. I wouldn't trade it for anything. Lanaya rushes to embrace her. Oh, Mother dear, I know you love me, but I understand. I really do. Bree wipes her tears and laughs. You've always understood, Lanaya, almost from the moment you were born. I've often felt like you were the contributor, and I was the child. Enough, says Jin. Both of you, please. The problem isn't with either one of you. The problem is with the child. It simply won't be allowed, no matter how much you say you care for him. And as to what the child really wants, we can't know that, can we? Because he can't tell us. Jin crosses his arms as if he thinks he's had the final word on the subject, but he hasn't, not quite. Because that's the exact moment when Little Face decides to start talking. I love Bree, the little boy says, as fierce as a latch boss declaring war. I love Bree, and Bree loves me. And that pretty much settles the question.